Thank you for joining us tonight. It's still a strange world we're in of screens, of communicating primarily through screens. I know when I did the last time I did a presentation for Aerosmith, I was able to be in person in front of an audience, a very different world, very different environment. But really, the world we're in right now, where we're doing these things through screens, is not only an exaggeration of the world we were already in. Even when I did that last session, I think it was 2 years ago, even then, being person to person had already become something of an exception. And we see now, because of COVID, because of the ways that it has changed our lives, we see how screens have taken over our world. And I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way, but it is a fact that we have to adjust to, and that we have to accommodate, and we have to find ways of finding balance in a world of screens. So let me tell you a little bit about MediaSmarts. If you're not familiar with us, we are Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. We're a registered charity. Our mission is to ensure that children and youth have the critical thinking skills they need to engage with media as active and informed digital citizens. Our website, MediaSmarts.ca, hosts one of Canada's largest collections of educational resources, period, and possibly the world's largest collection of digital and media literacy resources, including, of course, resources for teachers, but also quite a few resources for parents as well. We'll be putting some of those in the chat towards the end of the session, but I encourage you, of course, to check out the website as well. So this is a model of youth well-being, and you can see how complicated a question this is. This was developed for a paper called Education in the Digital Age. And digital technology, or what we're calling screens tonight, is really only a piece of the puzzle. And the other things are the things that have been part of youth well-being from the very beginning. So, of course, physical health, sleep, eating habits, play, emotional well-being, stress, mental health, family and peers, and the role that they have played in children's lives for as long as we've been human. But at the same time, as technology is only a piece of the puzzle, all four of these are interrelated. They all interconnect, and they all have an effect on one another. Digital technology has an impact on our physical health, as we'll see. It has impacts on our emotional well-being. It has impacts on our relationships with our family and our peers. And these, again, influence one another. And so in many cases, the role that digital technology plays in our lives will be influenced by our family. Whether a family has routines, whether the way that technology is integrated into family life or into a peer group will have an influence on all of these other things. And that's why I say, anytime we're talking about this issue, or really any one of the digital literacy issues that we address, it's not just about technology. And you'll see as we go through this session that there are a lot of things that I'll be saying that aren't immediately relevant to technology, but at the same time, it's not about technology. Technology is always going to be a complicating factor because we live in a world of screens, because we live in a mediatized, digitized world, and our kids even more so. Technology is always going to be a factor, and even when we're looking at other things, even when we're looking at other concerns, other strategies, other issues that relate to youth well-being, technology is always a complicating factor. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that is that phrase, screen time. Screen time is, for reasons you'll see in a couple of minutes, a term I don't particularly like. You may have noticed we didn't use it in the title, but we know that it is an important issue. It's one of parents' top tech-related concerns, according to our research, and it's actually the most common source of tech-related conflict, and that between parents and young people in Canada. So, and that was interesting, was that parents actually, it came in, I think it was tied for 5th among media and tech-related concerns. But it was the #1 source of conflict. So even though it's not the thing that parents are most worried about, it is the area where there's the most conflict between parents and kids, how much time kids spend on devices. And young people themselves are concerned about the time they spend on various kinds of devices and with various kinds of screen activities. So fully half of young Canadians, Canadian teens, say they spend too much time on their phones. Almost half say they spend too much time on social media. And 1 in 4 say they spend too much time on video games. So this is a concern not just for parents, and it's not just a source of conflict between parents and their kids. It is something that kids themselves are concerned about. And in many cases, we find that young people will use the same phrases, will reproduce the discourse around screen time, so that when they have these concerns, when they express these concerns, they tend to use the language of screen time. But at the same time, the evidence is really strong that screen time can be positive as well as negative. And that on average, when you look statistically at the entire population, it is positive at least as often as it is negative. There are at least as many positive effects as negative effects. Social networks, we've seen, of course, over the last 6 months, help teens and sometimes younger kids with help from parents keep in touch with friends and family. And that has been a lifesaver for so many kids. And in some cases, it has been a literal lifesaver, because if it is allowing teens who have a really natural instinct to socialize, if it's allowing them to express that without meeting in person, without having, while still being able to distance, that is literally life-saving. Video games have changed a lot, since Pac-Man, for those of you maybe like me who grew up in the 80s. They challenge children. They have a lot frequently of emotional impact. Many games these days, beyond just the physical aspect, have a lot of intellectual challenge to them, but also they help young people develop friendships. And that's why some of the most popular video games today, like Minecraft and Roblox, are ones that kids can play together. And we'll come back to that. But also just having them as an interest builds bridges. Very much in the way that, again, looking back to the 80s or the 90s, when there were a small number of TV shows that everybody watched. So there was always something you could talk about, and there was always something you could do together. And video games are that for kids today, that when you get groups of kids together, video games is something they always can talk about. And so when you are a child in a new situation, when you're in a new group, when you have people you don't know very well, it really provides an opening for socialization. And of course, we know that digital tools in general can be used to connect with support and health services. And that is something young people have been doing since the dawn of the internet. And they continue to do it. We know that they turn overwhelmingly to the internet when they're seeking information about health, when they're seeking support, and when they are looking for communities. So rather than talking about screen time, what we've developed in our work with the Canadian Pediatric Society, when we developed their recommendations or helped to develop their recommendations for screen use by young people as a model that is helpfully, I hope, alliterative. And when we add the recommendations for young children and the recommendations for older children together, we get 5 M's. And these M's are essentially how we recommend that you manage screen use and device use by your children, and how you teach them to manage their own screen use. They are to minimize, to encourage and mindful use, to mediate their screen use, to monitor the possible impacts of screen use, and finally to model positive screen use. So we'll be taking a look at each of those in turn, how we approach it, how it's relevant to some of the different issues we've talked about, and how it connects to other aspects of young people's well-being. So let's start with minimize, because that's in many cases where the advice starts and stops. When we talk about screen time, when we conceptualize this issue as screen time, we're limiting ourselves to just that first M. Now that is worth talking about, but I want you to keep in mind that it's just one tool in your toolbox. So the one time that we really do want to limit screen time is when we're talking about children under 2. There is a lot of evidence that young children should spend as little time using screens as possible because they don't get anything positive from it. Even some of the positive uses of screens that I'm going to be talking about a little later, they don't apply to young kids. And more than that, very young kids, of course, these first 2 years are where all the key brain development is happening. And they need things that they don't get from screens. They need to explore the world around them. They need to interact with other human beings. They need to develop their kinesthetic, their understanding of their own body. They just don't get that from screens. So there's 2 exceptions. One of them is reading. So reading, of course, with your kids is essential. And there's some evidence that reading on a screen to young children is not quite as good as reading from a paper book, because it is lacking some tactile qualities. So they're missing out on some of that physical element. But in general, it seems to be pretty similar and certainly much better than not reading at all. And that can be really helpful because there are library apps and there are also commercial apps that give you access to hundreds or even thousands of ebooks. So for instance, if you're going sometime in the future, if you're going on a trip, or if you have trouble getting to the library, or if the libraries are closed, our local library is still closed. We have to get in the car to go to a library, and even then we can just only go in for 15 minutes. So if going to the library or getting books in another way is a challenge for you, then reading on screens is absolutely worth doing. So the other exception is video chatting with people that they know. Now, again, that shouldn't be a substitute to interacting with live people, but if it's someone they know, if it's a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, something like that, a caregiver, then there is a lot of evidence that babies do get something from that. So with those 2 exceptions, though, it is very important that the youngest kids under 2 get a minimum of screen time. But when we move to older kids, you do want to limit time. You want to think about it, but don't focus on time. So when you're talking to them, it's best not to use the language of screen time. It's best for, you can keep track of it. You can kind of think, okay, how much time have they spent? But it's better not to use that language with them because you don't want them to be thinking about it in terms of time. What you want to do instead is set routines and establish screen-free times and places. So if there are certain times when screens are typically allowed and certain times when they're not, that's a better model. It's a better way of thinking about it than counting minutes. If you say, when we're together at the table, there's no screens, that again is a better model because it's saying not that screens are just a good or a bad thing, but that there are times when they're appropriate and times when they're not appropriate. And you can articulate that. You can say that dinner is a time when we spend together, and screens are distracting to us. Bedtime as well. And obviously there are always exceptions. Normally at this hour, I would be getting my kids ready for bed. My wife's doing it now. Normally all 4 of us would be up there doing that, and I'm here with you. So there are exceptions sometimes, and that's fine. But if kids recognize those exceptions, that means you've set the routine. But again, the important thing is that we not think about it in terms of total time. And the reason we don't think about it really in terms of total time is because that is starting with the assumption that screen time is just bad, and it's not. Screen time is, to a large extent, what we make of it. And if we treat it as being just bad, then we cannot make positive use of it. We're just going to try to limit it. It's also one of the reasons why I don't use the word addiction when it comes to screens. Kids do. They will talk about being addicted. And they get that, again, they get that from the media discourse, they get that from parents. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's simply not, it's kind of, I think, in a way disrespectful to people with genuine addictions. But also it's because it doesn't accurately describe what's happening. An addiction is when there is something that really is only harmful to us, and when the only thing that it does is addict us. There is no positive role for nicotine in our lives. What we have with screens is not an addiction. It is an eating disorder. Not the kind of acute eating disorder like anorexia or bulimia that a small number of people, but the eating disorder that we as a society have, that we eat too much, and more importantly, we eat bad things. We eat junk food. And we often don't even know that we're eating junk food because so much of what we eat has sugar and fat added to it that you don't even know about. So even things that are savory have sugar added to them. If you take a look at the ingredients of most chips, for instance, except really plain potato chips, there's going to be sugar in there. Sugar is added to everything because people who make it know that our bodies crave it. And it's important to recognize that. And we're not going to solve our eating disorder as a society unless we recognize that the system we are living in when it comes to food is rigged against us. That first of all, food that is bad for us is frequently cheaper than food that is good for us. But also that when we look at something like Doritos, this is something that has been engineered. A Dorito has been engineered with hundreds of hours of time put into developing it so that the purpose of each Dorito is to get you to eat the next Dorito. And the purpose of the bag of Doritos is to get you to buy that bag of Doritos instead of something that, might be better for you. And that is exactly the situation that we're in with digital media. That the devices that we're using, and in particular, the apps and the programs and the platforms that we're using are like Doritos. They have been developed to get us to use them more. They've been optimized in the exact same way that a Dorito has been optimized to get us to keep eating Doritos and to want Doritos every time we see a bag or we see an ad for Doritos. In the exact same way, the devices and the apps that we use have been optimized to get us to come back, to get us to spend more time on them, to get us to engage with them, but basically to come back to them. So what we need to do is very much what we need to do with food. And that is, we need to think about what we're doing. We need to try to find ways to make better choices. And that is what we mean by mindful use. It doesn't mean never using devices. It doesn't mean necessarily even trying to limit the time you spend on devices. It means using these devices in a way where you're aware of what they're doing to you or trying to do to you, and using them in ways that don't fall into that. So some of the things that you can do are to intentionally counter the aspects of these platforms and tools and devices that are getting you to use them more. So one really simple step, for instance, is to turn off notifications and turn off autoplay. Every single app on your phone wants to give you notifications, but you can turn those off. You just go into settings and you turn them all off, and then you stop getting all those bing, bing, bings. And that's what creates that Pavlovian response we get sometimes when you hear the bing. Ooh, there's something new. You can turn that off, and you should have that off by default. You can turn off autoplay. YouTube, Netflix, they both autoplay by default. And default, again, is what it's set to automatically. And the defaults of a tool are just as important as the affordances. What it's set to automatically is just as important as what it's capable of. And we know this is a huge, huge influence, the defaults. So I'll give you YouTube as an example. 70% of views on YouTube come from the up next bar. So they're not necessarily the thing that plays automatically, but they're one of those 5 or 6 things that's recommended for you to watch next. 70%. That's how powerful the default is. Same thing with Netflix. Netflix, they say this as a joke, that their enemy is not another platform. Their enemy is sleep. Their competitor is sleep. And they mean that seriously, that because it'll just keep playing unless you stop it, unless you turn that off, they are trying to compete with sleep. Similarly, on social networks, you can switch to chronological timelines, and that means things in the order that they appeared. Because what they do right now is they guess what's going to make you engage the most, what you're most likely to like or reply to or favorite or whatever. And they feed you those first. And then other things that maybe you would actually be more interested in, they show you later in a session, or they maybe don't show at all. But most of these social networks have the ability to switch to a fully chronological timeline. You can also curate your consumption by making playlists in things like YouTube. You can't do it in Netflix directly. There are third-party apps you can do for that. And on a web browser, you can make bookmarks. So instead of, for instance, going to the Google News app and letting it decide what to show you, you can bookmark your favorite 4 or 5 news sites and go straight to them. And you can also use apps that set curfews and promote mindful use. So there are apps that are screen time watchers. Don't use ones that just tell you how many minutes you spent. Find one that tells you what you were doing and how long each session was. Because if you find, oh gosh, I had 22-minute sessions on Twitter or whatever, that's telling you something really important about how you're using it that you wouldn't get if you were just told you had you spent 40 minutes on Twitter. So the thing to keep in mind is that the impact of screens, like the impact of media, is more complicated than we tend to think. It's not a direct impact. So some of you may have seen, for instance, the social dilemma. Some of you may have read articles similar to that, talking about what screens do to us. But screens don't do things to us. We do things with screens. Those things are influenced, as I said, by the affordances and the defaults of those devices and those apps. But that's an influence. It's a way of shaping our behavior. Sometimes that can be really powerful, as in the example of YouTube, but it is our choice. So what else can we do besides countering the specific technological aspects of these? Well, there are things we can do about the role that they play in our lives. So number one rule I would give to you, if you take only one thing away from this entire presentation, I would say keep devices out of bedrooms. Sleep is the single biggest impact on our health when it really comes to devices. And even if they're there, right, even if you're not using it, even if you have the willpower to not look at it right before bed, it still has an impact on the quality of your sleep. It's also important to take breaks and vacations from screens, to consciously have times, not just times of day, but full times when you're just saying, this is not coming with me, or I'm not going to look at it. It's a really good idea to set a one screen limit. Use one screen at a time so that you can choose to focus on something. You're going to have much better quality experience if you are looking at a movie, and honestly, or a TV show. And honestly, not very many, if you're streaming, if you're watching Netflix or whatever, there's no commercials. There's really no reason to be looking at your phone. There's no time to fill looking at your phone. You want to beware of artificial goals. And artificial goals are things that the programmers create to, again, try to keep you interested. In social networks, it's things like likes or faves or whatever. In games, it can be all kinds of things, leveling up, opening up a new level, getting a customization option. But if we're aware of those, if we're conscious and mindful of the fact that these are artificial goals, we can be more resistant to them. When we're using social media, we want to avoid the comparison trap. And that is what we know one of the biggest impacts on well-being of using social media in particular is when we use it not to communicate with others, not to socialize with others, but to compare ourselves to other people. When we look at other people and think about, this person looks happier than I am, they look, better than I do, that's where the negative impact is. And finally, a simple trick that you can do is add friction to your screen use. So even just instead of having your favorite social network as an app on your phone, but instead accessing it through your phone's browser and logging out every time. So that every time, instead of just tapping on the app, you have to tap on the browser, you have to navigate there, you have to log in. It may seem like a small thing, but just that little amount of friction can have a huge impact, because a lot of the time it is just in those moments that you want to fill, those moments when you don't feel like you have anything to do, when you're at loose ends. That's when you're going to be tempted to turn it on, and just adding that degree of friction can reduce the number of times you do that. There are absolutely negative impacts of screens, negative effects. Most of them come from passive or solitary use. So uses where you're just either sort of scrolling along, maybe occasionally liking something, or in something that is isolating you from other people. This is a study that was just done last month in California, where they asked teens about the impact of screens on their mood and other activities as well. But as you can see, almost all of these have some positive and negative impacts, but some of them are much stronger than others. So chatting with friends, either in person or virtually, had a really consistently strong impact. So did being with family. And keep that in mind, that even when they're teens, they want to be with you. How they're with you may have changed, but they still want you to be a part of their lives. Social media and gaming are powerful, positive impacts, but you'll see social media is negative about half as often as it's positive, whereas gaming is very rarely perceived as a negative impact on mood. And to a certain extent, I think that is because it is so much easier to use social media in a passive way. So what it comes down to in the end is that we're not minimizing screen time in total. We're minimizing sedentary time, and we're minimizing solitary time. So being sedentary, we all know, is bad for us. It's bad for us no matter what we're doing when we're sitting, when we're not moving for extended periods of time. it's not good for us. Being solitary is not in our nature. If something is causing you to spend more and more time alone, that's not good for you as a human being. But keep in mind, sedentary and solitary describes reading a book just as well as it describes looking at a phone. We don't think of reading a book as a sedentary or a solitary activity. Partly because books have been around longer. And yes, back in the day, there were people who were worried that books were having a negative impact on kids, particularly when paperbacks came out. But also because not too many people are going to spend their entire day reading. So the thing I would suggest is look at the phone in a child's life the way you would look at books. Imagine that if they were reading as often as they're looking at the phone, and not reading for school, but reading for pleasure. If you wouldn't get upset about them reading in that time, don't worry about them using screens. We also want to minimize those passive screen behaviors. So just scrolling through something without interacting with it, just mindlessly liking, and we know from particularly teenage girls, there's a strong pressure to like everything that your friends post. That's fine, but if that's all you're doing, if you're just doing it out of a sense of obligation, we know again, that's the kind of interaction or lack of interaction, that's the kind of screen activity that has negative effects. And surfing, and by surfing I mean just watching whatever the algorithm feeds up. So on YouTube, just watching whatever's in the up next. On Netflix, just watching an episode and then another episode. On TikTok, just letting the algorithm feed you video after video after video. These passive screen behaviors, again, are the ones that have the strongest negative impact. We also want to encourage positive screen activities. When we encourage positive screen activities, we help kids understand that screens can have a positive role in their lives. So one of the types of activities we want to encourage is things that are creative, when you're actually making something. And as someone who, as a child, I remember being incredibly excited to get, you will find this hard to believe, a tape recorder. Because all of a sudden, this was the first time I could ever make media with anything more sophisticated than a piece of paper. And I wasn't very good at drawing, but with a tape recorder, I could make radio dramas, which for 1980 me was astonishing. And now I look at the phones that we all have, where you can do amazing things. In many cases, we don't even know about the capacity that these devices have for media creation. Obviously, you want to encourage activities that are educational. And when I say educational, I don't just mean school. Because again, one of the biggest challenges in the past was helping kids explore things that interested them outside of school. And many of you have probably had this experience of having a child who was fascinated with something that wasn't taught in school. My older son will often say how frustrating it is that they don't teach about dinosaurs in school. He could tell you anything you wanted to know about dinosaurs. I'm sure there are lots of people listening who have kids with a similar facility with dinosaurs or robots or horses or whatever. But these things tend not to be taught in school. But thanks to digital technology, we can pursue those interests. There are active digital experiences that get you moving. There's Pokemon Go. There's Just Dance, if they like to dance instead. There are free ones too. So on the Switch, there's this game, I think it's called Jump Rope Challenge, where you use the Switch controllers to jump rope. And it's a great break. And if it's a rainy day or an ice stormy day or whatever, or if you're in lockdown, it can be a terrific way of burning off some energy. But even if you just have a laptop computer, there are a lot of free games that use the webcam where you're moving around and there's ninjas on the screen and you have to whack the ninjas or something like that. But there's no shortage of games like that. Almost every device, of course, these days has a camera. Any device with a camera can have active elements, but also you can make up your own active experiences. You can go places and find out about the place that you're going. You can set yourself a little quest. You also want to encourage activities that are genuinely social. So here we come again to video games, for instance, where there's a big, big difference between first playing a video game by yourself and then playing a video game with someone else who's not there physically, and finally playing a video game in the same room with someone else, which is really the best case scenario. But even playing online, again, if they're people that your child knows, and again, that's any one of these online games. Someone mentioned Among Us in the chat is a great way. It's basically like a video game version of the game Mafia, if any of you played that in school. And it's great to play with people you know. It's actually very difficult to play it with people you don't know because you don't know their tells. But playing video games, whether it is in the same place or whether it is through a digital connection, playing them with someone else is a great way of connecting. It doesn't have to be video games, though. Social networks, too, can be a great way to have genuinely social connection if we use them that way. And generally speaking, it's better in those environments to be in smaller groups. We know that when young people are connected to everyone in their peer group, they often feel very, they feel inhibited, as you can imagine, because everything they see, everything they do is going to be seen by everyone they know. Whereas if they can have a more private group, then they're able to relax a little bit. Some of the specific things that kids get out of positive media use: self-expression and publication. You can express yourself in a video, you can post it on YouTube, you can post it on Twitter, conceivably thousands of people can do it. Someone in the chat mentioned Scratch, which is a terrific coding language for young kids and older kids as well. You can use it to make video games, you can use it to make animations. It's 100% free, it doesn't even track your personal information. My younger son is a big Scratch fan, and it's terrific to see him expressing himself and getting feedback and knowing that people are playing his games. Similarly, particularly kids in underrepresented groups and marginal groups that don't appear that much in mass media, tell us that they get visibility and representation from digital media, that they are able to correct the record, as it were, that if they are not seeing themselves reflected in mass media, they can contribute to that. They can represent themselves and their groups. Similarly, young people find community and support. And again, that's really important for kids who may have various difficulties socializing or may feel isolated in some way. But even if they don't, finding support, we all need support sometime. And it's a great way of finding communities of interest. So again, Scratch is a great opportunity or a great example of a community of interest. And they can find guidance and mentorship opportunities that, again, these creative platforms and social platforms are ways of connecting and learning. And one of the things I love about Scratch is that you can remix anyone else's project. So it's a great way to learn from other people because you can look at how they coded something and you can use that code, and they also learn how to ethically give credit to other people. Mediating is key. So the other reason I don't like, or one more reason I don't like the screen time formulation is because it suggests that as parents, all we have to do is reduce screen time. And that is at best a small piece of the puzzle. What's much more important is mediating their media use. It's being involved in it and teaching them how to make positive use of it. So a lot of that is going to be asking questions. And that's one of the great things about this, is that you don't have to be an expert in the platform. You don't have to be an expert in the technology. What you need to know is what questions to ask. So some questions you can ask about any online activity. Why do you want to use it? Your child wants to do something online anytime. Why do you want to use it? What do you want to do with it? And that's a really key question, to phrase it in terms of doing. And who do you know who's already on it? And that may influence you one way or another. Some questions you might ask about a game. These get into the more practical concerns. How can you limit who can talk to you on it? Almost any game that is played online, even games for quite young kids, have ways of communicating with other people. And you want to make sure that your child knows how to, at the very least, turn that off. And ideally limit it so that they can choose who they talk to. You want to know if they have some idea what they can do if someone is mean to them. And you can find this out together. There's almost always some kind of moderator system or some kind of reporting system. Find out before they start playing. Find out how they pay for it. If it's free, find out if there's some other way that you're paying for it, because most free games, there are a small number of genuinely free games, usually made by nonprofits or TVO or PBS, things like that. But aside from that, usually if you don't pay to buy it, then you're paying later on. Sometimes it's through watching ads. A lot of times it's through in-game purchases. And frequently there can be a lot of pressure to make those in-game purchases. So you want to investigate that. Think about what things make you want to play longer. So what are those artificial goals? What are some of the aspects of the game that are going to make them want to play another 5 minutes? And what things make you want to play more often? So you can ask, if you had to skip playing this game for a week, what would you lose? How bad would you feel? Similarly, if your child is interested in joining a social network, you want to know, how can you control who sees what you post? Every social network has some kind of privacy settings. Kids don't always know how to use them effectively. We also know from our research with young people that they tend to rely on social cues, which has its values, but they work better in connection with actual privacy settings. What can you do if someone shares something you don't want them to? Even if there aren't necessarily tools on the platform to do something, just gaming this scenario prepares them for it. How can you control who can connect with you? Now, all our research going back for years shows kids have no interest in connecting with strangers on social networks, but they need to know how to avoid it. As with games, what things would you worry about missing out on? So if you had to go 6 hours, 12 hours a day without connecting, what would you feel you were missing out on? And what things make you need to check in often? So imagine if you've got a spare 5 minutes, what is it you're going to want to do on that app? Again, thinking about those, asking those questions guides us towards more mindful use. And one general point about mediating is that there are very few online platforms for tweens. So there actually are quite a lot of platforms that are aimed at young kids. And many of those, like Scratch, are very positive. Not all of them, but there are public television here and in the United States tends to have a lot of valuable stuff for younger kids, the National Film Board as well. And teens as well. Of course, once they're teens, they can participate in social networks, and there are games that they're more likely to play. But when they fall into that tween range, they're going to feel like they're too old for things that are aimed at younger kids. And in many cases, you're not going to necessarily feel like they're ready to just freely use things aimed at older kids. So think carefully during that period. They're going to need more active guidance than they did when they were younger, or than they will when they're older. Another way we can mediate their media use is to teach them to practice active empathy. One of the things about digital technology, of course, is that the things that trigger empathy in us under normal circumstances are not there. We can't see one another. We can't hear tone of voice. We can't get body language, even when we're doing a video chat, even when you're looking at someone's face, as you are doing with me right now. We tend to be static. We don't respond emotionally. Our emotions don't show in the same way that they would. So we have to make a conscious, active effort to be empathetic. So one of the things that we can do is to, before you do something, imagine someone's reaction to what you're saying. Think about, is there a situation where that might upset them? We want to teach from early on, get explicit consent before sharing or tagging. And we can model that starting very early. So as soon as your kids can even understand the question, you ask them before posting a photo of them, is it okay? Tell them, this is who is probably going to see this. Is it okay if I post this? And so you can say, I really like that picture of you in a Halloween costume. Can I post it? Either I am going to use privacy settings so that only your family members see it, or probably only your family members will see it. But modeling that idea that before you post something, before you share something with someone else in it, you get consent. Encourage them to talk conflicts out in person, because a lot of times when conflicts happen online, it is because of a misunderstanding. It is because of that empathy gap. So I say something to you, I don't realize that I've offended you in some way. Because I'm not getting that feedback, I don't walk it back the way I would in person. You respond to me angrily, I feel you're overreacting because I don't know why I've angered you. And all of a sudden, this misunderstanding has turned into a fight. So encourage kids, as soon as that happens, log off, say, let's talk about it tomorrow, and talk about it tomorrow. And we know, in fact, that that is very often kids' first choice. One of the reasons we do our research with young people is to identify the strategies that they're already using that are valuable, and we encourage those. And finally, get them in the habit of talking with friends and family about how they're feeling, because we don't often know how we're feeling. Again, when we're communicating virtually, digitally, we are sitting usually, sometimes lying down, but our bodies are immobile. We're not feeling like we're in them. And so we may not even know when something angers us. We may not be aware of it. So it's valuable to talk that out. When we're communicating with people and we can see them, there are ways that we can communicate focus on emotion. So one thing you can do is to sit back so that people can see more of your body, and to sit a bit off center. And that lets you move around a little bit. And it means that everyone's not facing one another directly. And make use of eye contact when you're speaking, or to show interest. And one great little hack is to put a pair of googly eyes on either side of the camera if you're using a laptop. And it is amazing how it stops being painful. You know, if you try to focus on that little camera for any amount of time, it becomes painful because it's not natural for us to be looking at just something that we know is not a face. But putting two googly eyes there, amazingly, our brains think of those as eyes, and it stops. It's like you're talking to a person. You can also be an active listener. So think about the signal that you're sending. Again, because we're doing this digitally, we have to do it consciously. So nod, lean in, turn from side to side, think about the things that you do to show interest. Use your sight line and your expression to show attention. So again, show that you're paying attention. And you can restate the last thing you heard before speaking. There's a great drama exercise that I used to do when I teach drama, where you have two people in a scene and you do a run of the scene where everyone starts by repeating the last line the previous person said. And what it does is it changes a scene from being two people saying their lines to people having a conversation, because it forces them to focus on one another. Now, you don't have to literally repeat it, but active listening means restating it. So you can say, so what you're saying is, or I'm hearing, or tell me if this is right, but restate it, and it shows you're connected, and it makes it a conversation instead of two people on opposite sides of a screen trying to talk at each other. Another part of mediating is establishing healthy boundaries. So if you're doing family video calls, and many people are, make it a part of your routine. Don't do them whenever you can. Say, okay, we're going to do them at this time, let's say between dinner and bedtime, before dinner, whenever works for you, but pick a time. And if it's not going to happen that time, then just don't do it. And if that happens multiple times, it doesn't work, then you're going to need to find a new time. But it really helps if those don't interrupt your routine. Again, don't multitask with screens. Use one screen at a time, but it's actually okay to doodle or fidget with something or have a pipe cleaner. Pipe cleaners are great. I used to hand them out to kids in class when I was a teacher. Anything to keep the hands busy, but doodling is really good because you can actually make a practice of being an active listener through doodling. You don't have to take notes, but you can draw whatever the conversation is making you think of. You want to take regular breaks away from the screen. So make sure that when you're taking a break, it's not to another screen. And I know the temptation, you've been working for an hour. It's like, okay, I'm going to go on Twitter for 10 minutes. Try not to do that. If you're going to go on Twitter, make going on Twitter the thing that you're doing, and then take a break from that. Similarly, have screen-free gaps between screens for work and screens for fun. And that is probably the question I've gotten the most often in the last 6 months is how do we balance? If they're doing remote learning, they're using the computer for however many hours a day. And of course, they still want to play video games or socialize. What do you do? Make sure that the gaps in between are screen free so that they don't just roll together. Make sure there's time in between. We have been talking about some negative aspects. Now, it's important to say that though the serious negative impacts are relatively uncommon, but you do want to watch for them. We don't want to assume that the effects of screens are going to be negative, but we do have to monitor for negative impacts. And we do know that kids who are vulnerable in general are more likely to feel bad if nobody likes or comments on their posts, to feel left out after seeing their friends' posts, and to have, in general, negative experiences on social media. So that's kids who are vulnerable generally for whatever reason. Maybe they're being bullied or teased at school. Maybe they are in a marginalized group at their school. Maybe they have mental health issues. It doesn't really matter. What the research has shown, going back to that diagram that I showed you at the very beginning, what the research has shown is that the kids who are most vulnerable online are the kids who are most vulnerable offline. So obviously, if you have reason to think that your children are vulnerable in whatever way, then you do need to be more concerned. But at the same time, they're also more likely to say that social media has an overall positive effect on them. They're also more likely to say that social media makes them feel better about themselves, and they're more likely to say that social media makes them feel less depressed. So in general, it's not just that vulnerable kids are more vulnerable to social media effects, as that all of the effects of social media and digital media in general are exaggerated with vulnerable kids. So that's, again, why I don't advocate just limiting time, because there is so much positive that they can get from them. So when we talk about monitoring, and obviously, as I say, if you know kids are particularly vulnerable, you're going to monitor more closely. But of course, you want to monitor kids in any case. When we talk about monitoring, we're really asking 5 different questions. So the first question is, have they lost interest in other activities? Now, that can happen sometimes, and it's entirely innocuous, particularly with tweens and teens. It's normal for them to get really into something for a while and then lose interest, get into something else. So if it's just that one hobby has passed to another, if they used to be really interested in, collecting hockey cards, and now they're really interested in watching skateboarding videos, then that's probably not a big deal. But if there are a lot of activities that used to give them pleasure, or if offline activities are being replaced rather than complemented by online activities. So if they used to be really into skateboarding and watching skateboard videos, and now they just watch skateboarding videos, then maybe you start to become concerned. Do you often have trouble getting them to stop? And I don't mean, that you have to ask them twice to come to the dinner table. I mean, if you have serious trouble getting them to stop, and it happens routinely. Do they get angry or upset if they can't use screens when they expected to? So if they really thought that they were going to get to play video games on Saturday morning, but turns out Saturday morning you all have to go, somewhere for whatever reason, and they get really upset by that, then that again suggests that there's something you need to tweak, something you need to deal with. Are they spending less time with family or friends? Again, it's that isolating quality. If they are really using them socially, if it's part of their socialization, then that's not necessarily a problem. But if it's leading them to spend less time with their family and friends, then it might become a problem. And finally, is screen use the only thing that can cheer them up when they're feeling low? And that goes back to the way it is similar to food, because of course that is one of the unhealthy habits that many of us have with food, that we use unhealthy foods to cheer ourselves up. And really any pleasurable activity can fall into that, and that can have a negative impact in any case. So think about it in the same way, just as if you would be worried if the only thing that would cheer someone up was eating ice cream. If the only thing that can cheer someone up is playing video games, that's a concern. And you want to think about that as well in terms of your own mediation of their screen use, that you want to avoid using them in that way. So our last M is modeling, that you want to model the same behavior and the same attitude to screens that you expect, that you want your kids to show. Because of course, what we do sends a much stronger message than anything that we say. And again, I realize the irony that I'm here on my computer talking to you instead of being with my kids. And again, there's always exceptions, but you do want to look at the overall pattern. And again, just like they're aware of concerns about their own screen use, kids are aware of this too. So half of teens say their parents are distracted by their phones. So they want more attention from us than they're getting. So think about that too. Think about everything that I've said doesn't just apply to our kids. What can we do? Once again, set office hours. See the irony. So many of us are working from home. Even if we're not working from home, frequently we take work home with us. As much as possible, set times when you are working and times when you are not working, and make a clear delineation between them. It's not enough just to tell kids to get off the devices. You need to organize non-screen activities. That's obviously particularly true with young kids, but it's true with older kids as well. As much as possible, you want to co-view and participate in screen activities with your children. Now, co-viewing doesn't necessarily mean actually sitting next to them. It can mean that, and that's great if you can do it, but it also means talking to them about their experiences. So when they're young, it can just mean talking to them. Well, what do you like about the game? Tell me about the game. What did you do in the game? What are you proud of? What are you happy with? Particularly if they're playing multiplayer games, talk about what they did with other people. And with older kids, it can become a more critical conversation where you're modeling the idea of being a critical consumer. But if you can participate together, and it doesn't take that many times. You don't have to play their favorite video game with them every time, but just playing a couple of times with them really makes it a more social experience, and it makes them more willing to talk to you about it. And that really is the essential thing, that if anything goes wrong, if anything ever goes wrong on the game, if anything ever goes wrong on a social network, you want to make sure that they can come to you. As much as possible, don't use screen time as a reward or a punishment. And going back to that ice cream example, that if we use screen time as a reward, then we're telling them that it's valuable, and we don't want them to think that. We're telling them that it is intrinsically valuable, and we're getting them in the habit of soothing themselves. If we use it as a punishment, then they focus, instead of focusing on learning how to use screens in a healthy, balanced way, they focus on finding ways around your rules. And finally, as much as possible, follow the same rules as the rules you set for your kids. They don't have to be the exact same rules, and there are going to be exceptions, just as you will make exceptions for them, and that's fine. Occasional exceptions don't outweigh the routine and the rules. But in general, if you're telling them no phones at the table, then you don't look at the phone at the table. And if you do, you acknowledge that you're making an exception, and you say why. You say, excuse me, I need to check the weather because I need to know whether you are going to need sweaters or not. Explain what you're doing. And honestly, if that's going to help you see if you're really doing it for a good reason. And so I am going to close with what the kids in the study, that those statistics a moment ago came from, what the rules they suggested for parents to leave you with. Don't spend all your free time on this stuff. Practice what you preach, and put down your phone when your child is trying to say something important. Thank you very much. You have been, from what I can tell, a terrific audience. I'm happy to take questions either through the chat box, or I don't know if we're going to do it on mic. But happy to take questions that anyone has.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was, I mean, so full of practical tips. I was taking notes for myself, and I think I'm probably not the only parent here who was seeing all these suggestions for children, but also, you know, thinking about it in terms of, okay, for myself, the amount of time that I might spend, you know, scrolling or going from screen to screen, as you were saying. I think it just makes you really realize, you know, as a parent as well, we have to be aware of these things. So like Matthew said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm also going to put in some resources that Matthew has given us. Let me see. Okay, I'm going to put them all in here, and hopefully that's easy enough to click. So there's a couple resources from MediaSmarts, so you'll see that in the chat. I will also include that in the newsletter that I'll be sending out next week. So you don't have to save that right now if you don't want to. Now I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, but as I said, I was taking notes, and I have a couple of questions, Matthew, if you don't mind. So you actually did touch on this. So, I mean, the reality of the life that we're living right now, where many of us are working from home, or our children are working from home for school. I love the advice of taking a break between screen time, because I think so many kids, you know, okay, online school is done, now what's my choice of activity? Go play video games, maybe. Do you have any other advice beyond that, just in terms of screen time, or just anything in general? Just it's so funny because we were saying this before the presentation, I'm trying not to use the word screen time. What's the proper, what do you like to say?
We talk about screen use.
Screen use, okay. Yeah. So, and I like screen use again, because it's about being mindful, and and I get that, but do you have any particular advice for the COVID times? Sure.
Well, a lot of the time it's going to depend on the format that your school is using. So these same principles really do guide what's best for online schooling. But unfortunately, we do know that there are some schools that try to just adapt a school day to Zoom. So generally, though, if you want to take things away from screens, if you want to be doing things without screens, try to find ways to take school away from the screen. Because, you know, there's really no reason for any child to be staring at a Zoom screen all day. There are a lot of things that you can do that are related to school, that don't necessarily have to be done on the screen. You can do them on paper. You can do them with a book. And if need be, just say there are going to be some times in the day when whatever's going on, I'm going to tell your teacher you're stepping away. You're going to be doing something else. You're going to go around the block if possible again, and you do it with them because you probably need those breaks too. Because it's just as hard. Again, for those of us who are working at home, that same problem is just as difficult for us. And so trying to build it into a routine is one of the best ways to address it. Really, you want to think about, again, what is being lost. So if you come to the end of the day or the end of the school day and there's been no active time, if there's been no time that's been spent out either moving around inside or outside, if there's been no time being genuinely social, then you find time for that. And any other recreational uses of screens come after that.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think, again, it comes back to, as a parent as well, being mindful, as you said, working from home, it's so easy, especially if we're in front of the computer, to, not move at all. So like, just as an adult being intentional, but also, knowing, if your child is in front of a screen for X many hours a day, then just making that family time, or even if it's just, if the child is off doing their own, non-screen time thing. That's really important for guiding. I see we have a comment here in the chat from Yaya. So Yaya is a student of ours for Aerosmith Toronto, and he wants to know, how do you get someone who is addicted? How do you get them off? That is a loaded question, and I know we don't like the term addiction. No, but that's a good question.
Sure.
I mean, yep.
And that is really, in a way, it's talking about a more extreme situation than what I've mostly been talking about, because we're not medical professionals at MediaSmarts. There is actually a really great resource. Michael Rich at, I believe, the Boston Children's Hospital. He's also known as the Mediatrician, and he does some great work with what he calls, he doesn't like the term addiction either. He calls it problematic interactive media use, because when you're a doctor, you have to give something a fancy name. But what is really interesting is that what he's found, and the researchers that work with him have found, is that in those relatively rare cases of chronic problematic interactive media use, where you might look at it and say, yeah, that looks kind of like an addiction, what is almost always the case is that the screen use is a symptom, that the screen use is what the child is doing to soothe themselves, in the same way that drug use is often a form of self-medication. That it is almost always, as they say, comorbid with other mental issues or sometimes physical issues. That is to say, it's found alongside them, but also that the effective treatment is treating the underlying issue. So which is not surprising. It's not surprising, again, going back to the example of ice cream, it's not surprising that if you have anxiety or depression or anything like that, and you find that an activity, whatever it is, relieves that, if it makes you feel better, you are going to start relying on that activity to make you feel better if that underlying condition is not treated. So that doesn't mean that we ignore the digital behaviors. You still want to find ways to, get them to maybe find better ways of integrating those behaviors into their lives. Scheduling, for instance, some of the other things that I was talking about. But fundamentally, if someone is in that chronic situation, you are not going to find a solution until you find another way of dealing with whatever it is they're turning to digital media to treat.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. Thank you, Matthew. And it looks like Vicky just looked up
yes, that's right.
Michael Rich resource, so you can click on that if you'd like to see more information. I also got a message from Lorna. She's asking, are video games worse or better than just watching Netflix or TV or Disney?
That, you know, there are so many different video games and there's so many different permutations. And even watching Netflix or Disney or something, it's a very different experience if you're doing it by yourself or if you're doing it with other people. So watching a video can be a social experience. If you have, particularly again, if it's part of a routine, if you have a family movie night and all of you get together and you pick a movie together and you watch it together and then talk about it or, you know, react in a whatever way, that's a really positive experience. If you're sitting watching Netflix and all night, you know, it makes you stay up till midnight and you fall asleep on the couch, that's probably a negative experience. Similarly with video games. If a video game there is challenging you, if a video game is giving you an opportunity to socialize or collaborate with other people, there are a lot of great video games that are all about collaboration. If it is giving you a chance to be creative, there are some video games, so Mario Maker, for instance, I think it's Mario Maker 2. So if you have a kid who loves the Mario games, there is a Mario Maker where you can make your own levels, and kids have a lot of fun with that. And you can also use video games as a vessel, as a way of getting to creative activities. So if they're interested in video games, you can find them some similar game projects on Scratch, and maybe they'll get interested in making their own. And all of that, of course, is leaving aside the issue of content, because on the media literacy side of things, we do have to think about the content, whether it's video games or movies or TV shows. And of course, we interact with content. Media doesn't have the same impact on everyone. And the impact that it does have depends in large part on how much we interact with it. So part of co-viewing, whether it's co-viewing with TV shows or movies or co-viewing with video games, it's talking about the content and modeling, as I say, the idea of critical consumption, but also asking questions and saying that it's okay to like some things or some parts of something and not another. So about a video game, you could say, you know, I really like the design looks really cool and I can see that it gets you really interested, but I wish it weren't so violent. I wish they gave you more ways to solve problems. Or if it's a TV show, you could say, well, I can see why you like this TV show. It's, you know, it's kids, you know, people like you solving problems, but I wish that there was more than one female character and that they gave the female character more to do. And you're introducing that idea that you can be critical, you can ask questions, and it doesn't mean you don't like it, and it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you for liking it. It just means that you don't have to, just like you can eat the pie but not the crust. You don't have to like all of it. It's okay to ask questions, and that's how we model that idea of being an engaged consumer of media, and that really is the heart of media literacy.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. I think because, I mean, for me at least, you know, when I hear video games, and I mean, I guess I'm being a bit hypocritical because how many hours did I spend playing like Mario Kart when I was younger? But I think sometimes I immediately go to, oh, video games that kids are playing must be all about violence. But it's, I mean, as you said, it totally depends that it's about being critical and asking questions. I also see Lorna had a follow-up question. So she said, was it found in the studies that there is text phobia? Because of learning disabilities, I'm almost forcing my son to have a phone and text people. He refuses to use a phone so that he can connect with others, so he's not isolated. So I pretend I'm him so that he can arrange play dates.
I haven't seen anything specifically about that. I mean, I know that different ways of communicating fall in and out of favor. So, you know, I know that very often young people, you know, would feel it's very intrusive to leave a voice message. there are a lot of kids out there who don't even, their voice mailbox isn't even initialized because it's considered to be very rude. So, I think it varies from community to community. I know that there are certainly kids for whom texting continues to be absolutely normal, and other ones where it's all done through a messaging app like WhatsApp, or it's done through the social network in various ways. So I don't know that there's necessarily, none of them is necessarily better than the other. What matters is finding a way for your child to be connected with their peers, and making sure that they're using it as a vehicle for socialization rather than a substitute.
And just thinking along those lines, Matthew, do you know anything? I'm curious because, I mean, not to age myself, but I mean, I didn't get a cell phone until I was in university, and that was like a flip phone. So I remember, when I first started teaching and I was seeing all of these, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds with smartphones. Of course, my first judgmental thought as a non-parent at the time was, why do these children have phones already? But, now you realize too, sometimes it's just like for emergencies or whatever. I mean, there's other reasons. So I feel like the lines are blurred in terms of, appropriate ages. Are there any recommendations out there in terms of how old a child, not like, you're 13 and you get a cell phone, but I know that 13 seems to be the age for getting on social media, I think. Is there anything in research or about what age for using these different platforms, or is it all kind of?
No, there's so many different contexts. If your child is walking to school and back on their own, then, depending on where you live, you may feel they need one. If you live in a rural place, there are lots of reasons why you might feel that a child needs one. And there are also reasons why you might feel that a child is ready for using for one. So one of the things to keep in mind is that it's much more difficult to directly monitor what kids are doing online when they're using cell phones compared to, say, a laptop. And we don't recommend that people use spy software or monitoring software unless your child has already shown you that there's reasons why you can't trust them. But as a default, we recommend against using monitoring software because it really prevents you from forming the kind of trust that is essential to teaching kids how to use these devices on their own guidance. So with a cell phone, you do kind of have to think about, do you feel that they have internalized the rules and the values that you expect them to live by? A cell phone can be a really great opportunity, though, to articulate those rules and values. So if you're getting a new device, or if they want a new device, or if you're passing one back, and you've never come out and said, these are the rules we expect you to follow, then it's a good opportunity. And then they are really clear. And our research has shown consistently that household rules about internet use do make a difference, even with teens. And they make a difference not because kids are afraid of being punished if they break the rules, because teenagers in particular are not afraid of punishment. They make a difference because rules are a way of communicating the values that you expect your kids to live by. And that doesn't mean that they'll never make mistakes, but it means they're a lot more likely to behave the way you want them to. One of the other resources that I don't think I included was we actually have a contract for a new device. I can send that to you, so you can send that in the newsletter. And that's, that again, you don't have to make it that formal, but you can if you want, and it's a good opportunity, whatever age the child is, if you feel they're ready for it, to use it as an opportunity to say, this is how I expect you to be using all of the digital devices you use.
That's really great. And I mean, I think it comes back to one of your takeaway messages, which seems to be and makes total sense, communicating with your child. And, you know, not just, I mean, it's funny when you brought up the like eating disorder example, or just, you know, comparing to food, it seems like that too, you know, like even, you know, with my 2-year-old, I'm like, how do I just let him eat cookies for days? Like that's what he would want to do. So I'm kind of in the stage of, I don't want to never give him cookies or sugar because I, you know, so I think it's about building that trust. And also because like you said, it's not like if you set a rule, you know, you can't have a phone till you're 16 and then, hey, here's your phone at 16, go wild. Like that's also not what you want to do. You want the kids to be able to monitor themselves and be mindful of that. So I think, yeah, that's a really great point, just to be just part of the process. And I like the idea of the contract. Yeah, if you can send them along. Sorry, mindful of your time. We have about 5 minutes left. I see Yaya is wondering how many minutes and hours should you be using screens? And I wonder, Yaya, if that goes back to your previous comment that you have strict screen time at your house. So we won't make Matthew say any direct numbers to get to anyone in trouble.
Yeah, as I said, there's no right answer for that. I mean, the answer is, you know, the not more than is good for you. So when we talk about time, again, it's about limiting not screen time, but limiting sedentary time and solitary time. So if you are getting enough active time, and if you're spending enough time being with other people, and you're getting your schoolwork done, then you know, screen time is not going to, there's no evidence that screen time is going to do you any harm. It does, the ways we use it can have negative impacts, and when it takes away sleep, exercise, time with friends and family, those definitely have an impact. But if it's not doing those things, then in general, it's not going to do any harm. But again, what matters is that you have routines, and sticking to those routines.
Great. That sounds good to me. All right. Does anyone have any last minute questions for Matthew? You can type it in the chat, or if you'd rather unmute yourself and ask, that's fine as well. Just while we're waiting, I did have one other question that I don't know if you'd be able to answer or not, but just in terms of, you mentioned ebooks. This is totally for me personally. Is it, because I'm like, I should buy a real book. Is it bad to read ebook? Like, I'm thinking before bed, you know, say you have the blue light filter off or whatever. So, is there any difference?
No, there really isn't. And in fact, the evidence around the blue light question is fairly weak. There are e-readers that have what they call, I think, a paper or a paper and ink finish. But even with something like an iPad, I mean, just the brightness of the light, I would not recommend reading on a small phone, because in order to be legible, they have to be quite bright, and that's not going to be necessarily good for you. But if you are using a larger device, or again, ideally something like a Kobo or Kindle, where it has a low contrast screen, there's no evidence that it necessarily does you any harm. I mean, I prefer a real book personally, but that's not always, you know, that's not always possible, and certainly an ebook is better than no book.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. That was totally my personal question. All right. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I think people are starting to leave, understandably. Matthew, thank you so much. You had such great information and practical examples in here. And I know that this presentation will get out to many more parents that were unable to make it to tonight's session. So thank you. We appreciate it. And thank you everyone for coming. I'll be sending out the video recording once it's available, and look out for some resources in our newsletter coming up. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Vicky says thank you. You're welcome, Vicky. And yeah, do something not on screens.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.